Hello and welcome to Antinatalism this week. Fallout and Philosophy Thinking Outside the Shelter is a recently published book which uses popular culture as a way of discussing philosophical questions. It contains essays dealing with questions about death, morality, politics, personhood, artificial intelligence, and of course, reproduction. Fallout, in its title, is a post apocalyptic science fiction franchise that began as a video game in 1997 and was later adapted into the Amazon television series. The basic premise is that a nuclear war has devastated the world, much of humanity has been killed, and the survivors live in a dangerous wasteland containing radiation, violence, scarcity, mutated creatures, and competing factions. Some people survive in the underground shelters called vaults, while others live outside in the wasteland. The franchise is interesting philosophically because it asks questions about morality, civilization, violence, human identity, and what kind of future humanity should build. The book also tackles these questions, including one particularly that is relevant to us. Could life in the post nuclear wasteland be so bad that it would be wrong to bring new people into existence? That discussion comes from chapter 2 called Should Lucy and Maximus Have Children? The Ethics of Reproducing in the Apocalypse, written by philosopher Eric J. Silverman. Silverman is a professor of philosophy at Christopher Newport University. His areas of interest include ethics, philosophy of religion, and medieval philosophy, and he has written several books dealing with philosophical questions about suffering, tragedy, evil, and virtue. The main question discussed in this chapter is simple. If you know that the world is dangerous and suffering is unavoidable, is it morally acceptable to have children? Silverman examines this question through the world of Fallout, particularly the possibility of Lucy and Maximus having children. Lucy is a young woman who has grown up inside Vault 33, one of the relatively protected underground communities. She eventually leaves the vault and enters the wasteland. Maximus is a young man associated with the Brotherhood of Steel, a militarized organization in the Fallout universe. Their stories bring together two very different experiences of the post apocalyptic world. And Silverman asks us to imagine a future in which Lucy and Maximus decide to have children. Would that be morally acceptable? For antinatalists, the Fallout universe provides an extreme version of a familiar problem. Even in ordinary life, bringing someone into existence means exposing them to disease, suffering, disappointment, violence, aging, and eventually death. But in Fallout, these risks are much more obvious. People face radiation, starvation, violence, war, and extremely insecure living conditions. Silverman therefore begins by presenting two important arguments against reproduction. The first is what he calls the harm argument. This argument is based largely on David Bennett's antinatalism. The basic idea is that bringing a person into existence inevitably exposes that person to harms. A person who is never created does not experience those harms. There is also an important asymmetry here. We don't have a moral obligation to create someone merely so that they can experience pleasure or happiness, but we do have a reason not to create someone if doing so will expose them to serious suffering. So, from this perspective, having a child is not simply a matter of creating the possibility of happiness. You are also creating a person who can be seriously harmed, and this becomes especially difficult in the Fallout universe. If your child is born into a world where radiation, poisoning, starvation, murder, and violence are ordinary possibilities, the risks are considerably greater. The second argument is the consent argument. The basic thought is that we normally believe that people should not be exposed to significant risks or harms without their consent. For example, if a doctor wants to perform a risky medical procedure on you, your consent normally matters. But when parents reproduce, they make an irreversible decision on behalf of someone who doesn't yet exist. The future child cannot agree to the decision, and the child will have to live with all the consequences. As Silverman explains, existence comes with pain, disappointment, loss, difficult moral moral choices, risks, and eventually death. None of these things were consented to by the person who experiences them. These arguments look fairly familiar to anyone who knows the work of Benatar or Schifrin. But Silverman is not defending these arguments. His chapter is actually an attempt to explain why he thinks Lucy and Maximus could still be morally justified in having children. And his first response is to challenge the assumption about what makes a life good. Perhaps the purpose of life isn't simply to maximize pleasure and minimize suffering. Maybe things such as meaning, virtue, love, relationships, helping others, and developing one's character are also valuable. He points to philosophical traditions such as Stoicism and Aristotle. From this perspective, a difficult life isn't necessarily a meaningless or bad life. Someone might experience hardship and suffering while still living a meaningful and morally valuable life. And Silverman argues that the Fallout universe might actually provide opportunities for exactly these kinds of lives. There are many people who need help. There are opportunities for courage, sacrifice, cooperation, and rebuilding society. So, a life containing suffering is not necessarily a life that is not worth living. He also makes a stronger claim. He says that existence itself may be a fundamental good. On this view, creating human being isn't merely creating a container for pleasure and pain. Human existence has value in itself. If that is true, then even a difficult life might still be preferable to non-existence. The second major part of his response concerns consent. Silverman agrees that consent is important, but he argues that we cannot simply apply the principle of consent to someone who does not yet exist. A child cannot consent to being born because there is no person there yet who can give consent. He compares this with decisions parents make for young children. Children cannot give informed consent to many important decisions, so parents are allowed to make decisions on their behalf, supposedly with the child's welfare in mind. Silverman therefore argues that parents can similarly make the decision to bring a child into existence. If Lucy and Maximus reasonably believe that their child could have a meaningful and worthwhile life, he thinks they can be morally justified in reproducing. He then introduces a further argument based on Kant's idea of universalization. What happens if we turn the principle that a person must consent before being brought into existence into a universal rule? Nobody could ever be born, and if nobody is born, there would eventually be no human beings capable of giving or respecting consent in the first place. Therefore, the consent argument becomes self-defeating when universalized. That's why the requirement of consent cannot logically be applied to the decision to create a person in the same way that it applies to decisions affecting an already existing person. And from there, he concludes that the consent objection does not establish that reproduction is inherently immoral. Finally, Silverman takes a broader position about humanity's future. He argues that humans have repeatedly survived extremely difficult conditions. Throughout history, people have lived with much greater risks, shorter lifespans, fewer comforts than people in many societies experience today. Yet, human beings continued to have children, build societies, and develop civilizations. So, even after an apocalypse, Silverman thinks it would be possible to rebuild. And this is why he ultimately rejects the antinatalist conclusion. Now, I don't agree with what Silverman has said. I think a full response video can be made. But in the interest of time, I'll move on. Maybe you can let me know in the comments what could be the responses to Silverman's views. Recently, a new paper was published, The Rise of Female Autonomy and the Decline of Fertility, the Role of Mismatch by Claudia Goldin. Claudia is a distinguished economic historian and professor of economics at Harvard. The paper is focused mainly on the data from the United States and provides an economic and demographic explanation for why people increasingly choose not to reproduce, even though Goldin herself is not making an antinatalist argument. She says greater female autonomy reduces fertility, education, employment, reproductive rights, and contraception allow women to decide whether, when, and with whom to have children. This has been a major driver for fertility decline. Having a child has a real opportunity cost. For educated women, motherhood can interfere with career and earnings. As the economic value of education and careers rises, the cost of having children rises too. Women may rationally choose childlessness rather than accept the risks of parenthood. If a woman cannot be confident that the father will reliably share children, she may decide that having a child is not worth sacrificing her career and autonomy. The asymmetry of reproductive burdens matter. Golden's model assumes that women bear a larger share of childcare when men do not sufficiently participate. Countries where women perform substantially more household or care work tend to have lower fertility. Modernization therefore creates a mismatch. Women increasingly want autonomy and careers, while some men and social institutions retain traditional expectations. The result can be delayed reproduction, fewer children, or permanent childlessness. Intensive parenting makes the decision even harder. In societies where parents are expected to invest enormous amounts of money, time, and effort into producing a highly successful child, highly educated women may be particularly reluctant to reproduce. Reproductive freedom has effects beyond contraception itself. The contraceptive pill introduced in the US enabled women to delay marriage, obtain more education, establish careers, and become economically independent. This explained their ability to opt out of unwanted reproduction. Childlessness became substantially more common. Among the US college educated women born in 1955, eventual childlessness reached 28%. Now, from the United States to South Korea, there was a paper on how Korean women are pressurized to have children. From childless intentions to motherhood, familial pronatalism among Korean middle-class women by Goo-won Young and Jeon Park. It's about a study which examines 33 married Korean women who initially intended to remain child-free. 14 later became mothers, while 19 remained child-free. The authors identify familial pronatalism, that is the way family relationships subtly encourage or pressure people toward reproduction, as the cause behind this shift. Child-free intentions are not always stable. After marriage, some women's preferences change through interactions with husbands, parents, in-laws, relatives, and peers. Family pressure can manufacture urgency. Relatives repeatedly discussing fertility, infertility, and the biological clock generates anxiety, particularly around age 35, pushing some women toward attempting pregnancy. Pronatalism can operate without explicit coercion. Persuasion, emotional appeals, offers of childcare, and repeated suggestions such as children are cute or you'll regret it later on can gradually erode resistance to reproduction. Death and grief can become pronatalist triggers. Some people interpret childbirth as a way to replace loss with new life, preserve family continuity, or provide meaning after relatives die. Children are sometimes viewed as a solution to relationship problems. Family members encourage some women to have a baby to strengthen, revive, or stabilize their marriage, including cases where the marriage is already seriously troubled. Accidental pregnancies are not necessarily socially neutral. The authors argue that apparently accidental transitions to parenthood can occur within an environment of family expectations, emotional support, and caregiving norms. The paper challenges the idea that reproductive decisions are purely autonomous individual choices. It shows how social conditioning, family expectations, fear of infertility, fear of aging or loss, and relationship expectations can reshape a child-free preference. On the notable videos, there were many videos actually, but I could only watch one of them so far. It was a response video made by Lawrence to Ronnie Fawkes, who tried to criticize antinatalism, but in fact just accuse antinatalists of being depressed. Lawrence correctly points out that just because someone is depressed does not mean their observations are not reliable. If antinatalists are depressed, that is not an argument for antinatalism, and one does not have to be necessarily depressed for them to be an antinatalist. And those were some of the stories this week. Thanks for watching and see you next time.